What's happening, guys? Welcome to the David F. Haas podcast, episode 134 in the studio solo today. But today's podcast is about why anxiety happens, what you can do to break free from anxiety for good. This is something that I was able to do for myself back when I was, less aware and less conscious, not doing this work. I suffered from multiple anxiety attacks, and this was before you could even, before we even had a label for anxiety. Probably experienced all sorts of symptoms related to anxiety, but we just didn't have a label for it. But I was able to transcend all of that. And so I think if you're suffering from anxiety, this is a podcast for you. If you've kind of been trying everything and you're, this is not working. I've dealt with multiple clients that are on anti-anxiety medications, and it's just like, it doesn't work. So they try a different medication, doesn't work. They try a different, and it's because the answer is not out there. All the answers come from within. And so if you understand this one key element or principle of anxiety, you are basically opening the door to be breaking free from this thing for good. And so after I give you that one key element, I'm also going to walk you through 5 steps that I think that you can put into place immediately that will begin pulling you out of this state of anxiety and all of the symptoms that come along with it. Before I get to the one key principle, I do want to start with this, though, is that the recognition that, it's something I say a lot that kind of like gets people like taken aback a little bit, but I just encourage you to kind of push through when you hear me say this. But diseases don't exist. And so what do I mean by that? Well, essentially, all diseases is a collection of symptoms that we are experiencing that we have now given a label. And actually, me giving you that account of what I went through, 20, even farther, maybe 20 years ago, I guess. I didn't have a label for it. I couldn't call it anything, right? And so it was just a panic attack then. So that was the only label, but there was other symptoms of uneasy stomach, tension in the chest, all of these things that would now today be labeled anxiety, right? But I didn't have a label for it. And so I guess the best thing to understand is that all anxiety is, first and foremost, is a label we have given to a collection of symptoms. And so when we give a label to a collection of symptoms, then what we end up doing is we give that label power over us. And so then, you can't go to a social setting because of your anxiety, right? And it's like this thing that's out there that has come to get you. And once you start to recognize that all anxiety is a collection of symptoms that we've given a label to, right? Then you can start to take your power back from anxiety. So that's the first thing that you have to understand, is that diseases don't exist. And the best example of this is my mentor, Andrew, always told the story about this illness that only exists in Italy. And if you get exposed to this disease, you'll have a cold, sore throat, you'll be in bed for weeks. And you know what the illness is? If you leave a door and a window open at the same time, or 2 windows open at the same time. The belief was so ingrained in Italians, and this obviously, I'm sure now, like this has gone away, but in old school Italians, the belief was so ingrained in them that if 2 windows were open at the same time in a house, or a door and a window were open at the same time in a house, you would get this disease, right? And so the power of the disease is only created by our own belief that the disease exists. And Hawkins, who is another mentor of mine, even though it's like I never worked with him, but I've basically consumed all his material. He said a disease cannot exist without the belief that the disease exists. And so in this kind of explanation, you begin to take back your power from this thing that you think was out there that came and got you. It never came and got you. Your body, your mind created it, and your body and your mind can pull you out of it as well. Okay. And so there's one key principle that I want to tell you about that will begin pulling you out of this. And it's going to begin giving you this understanding of what anxiety really is this one simple thing, is that all anxiety is a projection to the future. Okay. And so when we start labeling anxiety, we stop looking at what we are having anxiety about. And so when we say, oh, it's my anxiety, we stop asking or becoming inquisitive and saying, well, what is it that I'm actually thinking about? So the process of overthinking, if it is left unchecked or left unobserved, we will continue to overthink and overthink and overthink until it actually starts to show up as physical symptoms in the body, right? And this is when we're experiencing the pit in the stomach, the uneasiness, the feeling like you want to barf, the tightness in the chest, the rapid heartbeat, everything that goes along with it, even meltdowns, tears, panic attacks, can't breathe, whatever goes along with it. All of that is this continued projection into a future that does not yet exist. But the real question is, what is that projection? What is the purpose of that projection in the first place? And this is when we get into the 5 steps that you need to begin to implement in your life, is the pattern of overthinking, if left unchecked, will then be called anxiety. Okay? Apparent anxiety, we could probably call it. And so the first thing that we want to do is we want to recognize that if we have anxiety, we probably have anxiety or overthinking about having anxiety. So we have fear of fear, right? So when you experience one panic attack, you never want that to happen again. So now anytime you experience, the onset of symptoms of anxiety, then we begin to overthink more and more, and then it eventually leads us into actually having a panic attack. So it's the process of overthinking that is actually the problem. So overthinking left unchecked becomes anxiety, okay? And so the first question we need to ask ourselves is, what are we overthinking about? And what is that overthinking protecting us from? And now if we've given anxiety the label and it has the power of us, we're never even going to do this insight. We're never going to look within, because it's anxiety. It's not coming from us. It's coming from out there. So now you're listening to this podcast, you have the wherewithal to go, oh, wait a second, I created this, I can uncreate it essentially, right? And so if we recognize it's all a projection, if we recognize that we have anxiety about having anxiety, that is our first observation. We are beginning to think about having anxiety. And if we're thinking a lot about having anxiety, it will result in a panic attack. And so the overthinking about having a panic attack, right, is trying to prepare us and to protect us from that negative outcome. And this is essentially what all survival patterns are. There's all kinds of survival patterns. There's perfectionism, there's self-doubt, there's avoidance, there's escape, there's addiction. There's all of these mechanisms that we use to protect us from re-experiencing emotional pain. Anxiety or overthinking, right, is also a survival pattern that is protecting us from something. But if we don't know what, that mechanism cannot be removed. We have to remove the source of pain so that we can remove the mind's protection from re-experiencing that pain. And so step 1 is to recognize we have anxiety about anxiety, and we can just observe that. Step 2 is to identify, once you go beyond having fear of fear, to identify what the mind is overthinking about. So when you feel the symptoms of overthinking coming on, you want to step back and take this observer approach to the mind, where you can actually begin listening to what you're telling yourself. And if you start listening to what the mind is telling you, what you're going to find is that there are a few things that the mind is constantly projecting to, and it is doing so continuously. Okay. So let me give you an example to better explain this. My mind was constantly focused on making more money. It consumed every ounce of my thoughts, right? And if I was put into a situation where money became tight, the symptom of anxiety would come up. And so all of that, I would then go into this endless overthinking about that I have to work harder, I have to do more, or if my money for some reason, was tight and I was behind on bills, it's like something I experienced over and over again until I learned how to pull myself out of it. I would experience the symptoms of anxiety because my mind was trying to come up with a solution to pull me out of the pain of not having enough. Okay. And so when I learned how to observe that the primary source of all of my thoughts was all a protection to avoid the pain of not having enough, I could then begin asking myself the question of, well, where did I first experience that in my life? Okay, so I'm kind of skipping through the steps here, but step one is observe that you have anxiety. Step two is identify the source of all your thoughts. You're just listening to what your mind is repeating. And the crazy thing about the mind is that it's crazy and it will tell you the same thing over and over again in a million different ways. Okay. So for me, all of my thoughts were about making more money, which is really a protection from not having enough. But it would tell me that in thinking about money making ideas, thinking about how much money I had in my bank. It was just endless, and it was in all types of forms. But if I really looked at it, it was all about just one thing, making more money. And that was about one protection from the protection of the pain of not having enough. Okay. So once we can observe our thoughts, we're in step 3, we can then identify what these thoughts are protecting us from. And this is when it gets to the point where people really kind of don't want to do the work, because once you identify the source of your pain, 2 things can happen. One is just the awareness of that thing that you're avoiding may be enough to pull you out of it, right? Sometimes awareness alone is enough to begin a major shift in your life. For example, the awareness that anxiety hasn't come to get you. This is something that you created, and so that is something that you can change, may be enough to shift you out of anxiety on its own. Like, that's how powerful that intention, or that awareness, I should say, is. So if you have the awareness that you are avoiding the pain of lack, for example, in my case, that awareness alone might be like, oh, I can handle the pain of not having enough, right? Now, the problem is that when you identify a pain that you're avoiding that you don't want to go to, like everything in your being is telling you to not even go there. And in fact, the mind has created anxiety or overthinking to try and protect you. But if that mechanism goes left unchecked for too long, right, it eventually attracts into your life the thing that you're avoiding, which is just wild, right? It's like, think of it like an alcoholic. Let's say an alcoholic drinks alcohol because he wants to be accepted by everybody. But if he continues to use that mechanism over and over and over again, he eventually will not be accepted by anybody because he's a drunk, right? So the thing that the mechanism was trying to protect him from, which was the pain of not being accepted, eventually leads him to the pain of not being accepted, because now he has a drinking problem, right? So your anxiety, unconsciously, the mind thinks it's protecting you, but left unchecked, it'll eventually attract that exact thing that you don't want to ever re-experience this. And for most people that have experienced a panic attack, the first step is to get out of the fear of having a panic attack, because the thing about a panic attack is that you're out of control, and there's no greater fear than not being in control, right? And so you never want to re-experience the pain of not being in control, not being able to catch your breath, not being able to breathe. Like, that is tapping into our deepest fear, which is a fear of death, okay? And so when you begin to recognize that, even if I have a panic attack, I'm going to be okay. I'm not going to die, right? I might be embarrassed, and that might be another thing that you're avoiding, right? I might be embarrassed that I have this panic attack in front of a bunch of people. If you're on a plane or something like that, that embarrassment is another fear that the overthinking is trying to protect you from. But as you begin to develop the awareness of what overthinking is protecting you from, you then move towards leaning into that feeling. And that's the 5th step, is once you identify what the overthinking is protecting you from, you can then say, okay, it's protecting me from the pain of not having enough, right? And then consciously you can walk yourself through, well, what would happen if for me, if I couldn't pay my bills, right? Or if my car got repossessed or something along those lines. Then I could first observe that I would be embarrassed. I would feel like a failure. So the fear of failure is another one that comes up. And then ultimately I would think that I was not going to be able to eat and not have a place to live, and eventually I would die, right? And so for me, the process was, one, to create awareness that I was avoiding the pain of not having enough, the embarrassment that came along with that, the shame that came along with that. And then what I had to do is I had to begin reconnecting, and this is the fifth step, to those original incidences, because this is how the mind works. You experience some sort of negative consequence. Let's put it in the physical world. You touch a hot stove, the mind immediately goes, never touch a hot stove again. And now you avoid with all caution every time you're around a hot stove. Oh, better keep my distance. Better make sure I have a pot, a rag to grab the pot. Like whatever it is, the mind has developed the tools to make sure that you never reburn yourself. Well, that same thing is happening with emotional pain. The only problem is that we are completely unconscious of most of it. And so in order to create consciousness of it, we have to start asking these questions. But we can't ask these questions if we've given the label of anxiety all of our power. So when you start asking these questions, then what you want to ask yourself is, well, where did I first experience this pain in my life? When's the first time I can connect to the pain of not having enough? When's the first time I can connect to not being accepted by a group? When's the first time I can connect to being completely out of control, right? And as you do that, then the sixth step is you have to begin taking yourself back to that moment and allowing yourself to re-feel that pain, because it's the avoidance or the resistance to re-experiencing that emotion that has created anxiety. So if we can sit in that emotion and be okay with it, then the mind no longer needs a mechanism of protection. And so I've given this example a million times, but I'm going to give it again. If somebody's fearful of heights, their whole entire life is about avoiding high spaces. They won't fly on planes. They won't go on elevators. Their mind is constantly making sure that they don't get into situations where they're going to be high up. But if they finally have the wherewithal that this thing is limiting their life and they're not able to enjoy life and they're not able to travel and spend time with loved ones, they say, I want to face this thing, right? They could just go stand on the edge of a cliff or stand at the top of a tall building, and they could allow themselves to be completely in the emotion of fear, right? And eventually that fear is going to reside. Eventually it's just going to burn out. And now that person can walk around the whole entire edge of that building or edge of that cliff without any fear whatsoever. Now the mind goes, oh, this is not a fearful situation. There's no longer any need for us to come up with scenario after scenario to make sure that we never re-experience this, because we're no longer fearful of this, right? And so this is essentially what you have to do with where you first experienced that. Now, don't get hung up, and this is where so many people get trapped, is don't get hung up on finding the exact original incident, right? When you make the intention to say, what are all my thoughts about, right? Maybe you have anxiety about not being in good enough shape, right? All you think about is what you're eating, and you have fear around the food that you're eating, and you're over-exercising and all of this stuff. Your mind just is constantly thinking about trying to get into better shape, right? To the point where it's creating anxiety in your life. Well, if you start to recognize that that's what the mind is constantly thinking about, you can then ask yourself, well, what is all of this overthinking? What is this need to get in shape really all about? Oh, it's about the pain of rejection, right? Never wanting to experience the pain of rejection. Someone called you fat once in your life, and from that moment forward, that hurts so bad as a little kid that you are now driving yourself crazy to make sure you never re-experience that pain. And once you have that awareness and you make that link, every thought that shows up about getting into better shape can be linked to the avoidance of the pain you experience as the 6-7-year-old fat kid. Okay. So don't worry about identifying what incident it is. Just whatever first pops into your awareness, that's where you want to go. And once you recognize that, oh, okay, it's around this incident when I was 10 years old, Tommy from grade 6 called me fat, and everyone laughed. And I went home and cried all night. And as an adult, we look at that and we go, oh, well, that's no big deal. Like, it's kids being kids or whatever. But if you connect yourself, if you envision yourself going back to your 10-year-old self and sitting next to her in that moment, or him, and asking him or her, how are you feeling right now? they are devastated. It is the deepest, darkest pain you can ever imagine. They're actually even at the point of like not wanting to live anymore. That's how intense that pain is. And that is the pain that you've been avoiding your whole entire life. So what we have to do is we have to give that 10-year-old the space to finally sit and feel that emotion completely without resisting it, with just allowing ourselves to be in it. And if we do this properly, without resisting it, without letting the mind come in and justifying it or condemning it or rationalizing it by saying, it's just kids being kids, right? If we allow ourselves to really be in the emotion will lose its power. And then the mind will no longer need the mechanism of protection. And then you'll be free of anxiety. And this is the process. And this is what I've done for myself. This is what I've done for lots of clients. I don't know how many, like probably, I've had hundreds of clients. So not all of them have anxiety, but a good majority of them recognize that there are survival patterns. One of them being overthinking, which we have now given the label of anxiety, right? And all of that overthinking is protecting you from something that you're avoiding. And if you can identify what it is that you're avoiding and allow yourself to be there, you can break free from the need to protect ever again. And that's what we do. That's the process of letting go. That's the process of spiritual growth. That's the process of moving up the scale of consciousness. That's what I've dedicated my life to. And I also dedicate my life to sharing it with others because I think it's the most important thing in the world. That's it. Thanks for taking the time to listen. If you enjoyed it, if you got any value whatsoever, hit that like, hit that subscribe, share with a friend that's suffering from anxiety. Because as we pull ourselves out of this thing, if you heal from your anxiety, you are helping others heal just by you healing. There's nothing you need to do, right? You have now expanded collective consciousness for what it takes to actually break free from this thing. So in helping yourself, you're helping others. That's it. See you again next Sunday.